Hello, friends, and welcome to my new episode. Today, I'll be talking about a couple of people who played a huge role in changing the landscape of Hindi commercial cinema of the 1970s and 1980s. The people I'll be talking about are Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar, better known as Salim Javed, a couple of scriptwriters who, with their pens, changed the way Hindi cinema came to be in that period of the 70s and 80s. Salim Khan Saab was born in 1935 to Aslam Khan, a DIG in Indore, and Javed Akhtar Saab was the son of the noted poet Janisar Akhtar. He was born in 1945. And it was years later, on the sets of an obscure film called Sarhadi Lutera, that Salim and Javed met for the first time. Salim was playing the role of the hero in the movie, and Javed Akhtar had been hired to write dialogues for the film. That's how they met, and when they met, they decided to write stories together. One of the first stories Salim Javed wrote was for the then superstar Rajesh Khanna. It was basically reworking a script he had already had for a film that he had signed. They reworked on the script, and eventually it turned out to be Hathi Mere Sathi, a huge bumper hit in the career of Rajesh Khanna. That was the beginning of Salim Javed as a pair of writers in Hindi cinema. Following Hathi Mere Sathi, Salim Javed got associated with Sippy Films in GP Sippy, who was producing a film for his son Ramesh Sippy, who was making his debut as a director. And the film turned out to be Andaz, written by Salim and Javed. Andaz was quite a unique story for its type. It was the story of a widower and a widow who fall in love with one another. And it was quite an unusual story for its time and did very well. And it marked the beginning of Ramesh Sippy as a director. And also, Salim Javed began to be taken a little more seriously as writers. Following Andaz, they did GP Sippy's next film, also directed by Ramesh Sippy, and it was the hugely successful Sita Aur Geeta, which was a very clever reworking of Dilip Kumar's earlier film Ram Aur Shyam, a story about identical twins but of completely different natures. One, the quiet, sedate type, and the other, the bubbly, effervescent type. And Sita Aur Geeta turned out to be this bumper hit, and Salim Javed were now a name to reckon with. The amazing thing about Salim Javed is, I think one of their biggest contributions is the fact that they gave a certain recognition, a certain identity to writers of Hindi cinema. Till then, writers tended to stay in the background and were never really spoken about or mentioned. Salim Javed, I think, were the first, if not only, writers who were actually given credit in the billings. In the posters of the movies, one could see their name very prominently featured. And that, I think, is one of the huge contributions to Hindi cinema, that writers were being acknowledged and identified. Around the time of Sita Aur Geeta, Salim Javed had a script which they kept showing to different producers. It was the story of a young man who witnesses the murder of his parents and grows up to be a police officer and avenges his parents' death. Now, they took the script to Prakash Mehra, who was at that time making Samadhi with Dharmendra. And Prakash Mehra and Dharmendra both loved the script and decided this would be their next work after Samadhi. However, for whatever reasons, Dharmendra couldn't devote enough time after Samadhi was completed, and Prakash Mehra was keen to start the movie immediately. The movie went through a lot of casting changes. Devanand Saab was approached, Rajkumar was approached, and they all refused the role because they couldn't understand the character. This was a character which was never really seen in Hindi cinema before, that of a shy, introverted, a quiet, a brooding kind of a hero who really didn't have flashy dialogues or songs to sing. And no one really knew what this character was about. And eventually Salim Javed convinced Prakash Mehra to sign a relative newcomer who just had a few films ahead till then, and that was Amitabh Bachchan. And Amitabh Bachchan was signed for this movie, which eventually turned out to be Zanjeer, a landmark movie in the history of Hindi commercial cinema because it marked the birth of the angry young man. Audiences had never seen anything like this before. The kind of sullen, silent, simmering anger that Amitabh portrays in the movie was largely the credit of Salim Javed's writing. And Zanjeer turned out to be this huge, huge hit. Following Zanjeer, the angry young man image was further cemented by another landmark film written by Salim Javed, and that was Yash Chopra's Diwar. A very, very clever reworking of two hugely successful earlier films, Ganga Jamuna and Mother India. Diwar really catapulted Amitabh Bachchan to the top league. It was a huge success. Along with Diwar came another success, which is the benchmark of all successful films in Hindi cinema, in Indian cinema perhaps, and that was Ramesh Sippy's next film after Sita Aur Geeta, Sholay. Sholay was this cult classic which has gone down in the history of Hindi cinema as perhaps its greatest offering ever. And it absolutely established Salim Javed as writers on top of their game. Everything they touched from there on would be absolute gold. Salim Javed went on to do a lot of other commercially successful films like Shan, Shakti, Dostana, the iconic Dawn, Kala Patthar, Trishul, a huge number of movies, most of which starred Amitabh Bachchan in the lead roles, and were hugely successful. And they were really the extension of the angry young man image which they had so brilliantly cultivated. But Salim Javed had hits without Amitabh Bachchan as well, in movies like Yadon Ki Barat, Haath Ki Safai, and later movies like Kranti, which were super hits and didn't have Amitabh Bachchan. As I said earlier, Salim Javed have been credited as the creators of the angry young man, which is perhaps their biggest credit. But I think Salim Javed also brought in a certain sensibility to commercial Hindi cinema. You know, their movies were out and out commercial cinema. It wasn't the so-called art film or serious film as it is labeled in India. They were pure commercial ventures with songs and dances and villains and comedians. But nonetheless, Salim Javed brought in a certain sensibility, and I think that has a lot to do with their respective backgrounds. They came, they were a certain type of people, and that reflected in their writing as well. And no matter how commercial the setup and how cliched the situation, Salim Javed always came up with winners. The last film, I think, in which Salim Javed worked together as writers was Zamana, which starred Rajesh Khanna and Rishi Kapoor playing the role of two brothers on opposite sides of the law, both avenging their father's death. Zamana didn't do well. It was a long delayed film and looked dated by the time it had come. But the last script of Salim Javed that was made into a movie was 7 years after they broke up in 1981. The movie was released in 1988 and was Shekhar Kapoor's brilliant Mr. India. Mr. India was a film that was conceived way earlier, and it had Rajesh Khanna and Mumtaz in the lead roles, but for whatever reasons that didn't get made. Amitabh Bachchan and Rekha were also considered at one point in time to do the film. Didn't happen, and eventually it was Anil Kapoor and Sridevi who played the lead roles in Mr. India, and it turned out to be a bumper hit. With Mr. India, Salim Javed also completed a trilogy of sorts of giving Hindi cinema memorable villains. This began with the first memorable villain, Gabbar Singh in Sholay, which was followed by the suave Shan, Shakal in Shan, and then Mogambo in Mr. India. And these three villains will definitely go down as three of the most iconic villains in the history of Hindi cinema. and they're all to the credit of Salim Javed. Salim Javed, after they broke up, did work individually as well, independently. Salim had successful films like Naam and Falak to his credit, whereas Javed Saab had blockbusters like Betab, Arjun and Sagar to his credit. But the magic that Salim Javed had created when they worked together was never evident in their solo work. It's good to see after so many years that Javed Saab and Salim Saab have buried their differences and often appear together in interviews and press meets. So it's a good sign that the two great people are back on talking terms and on good terms again. I don't think we will ever see a script written by them again, but it doesn't matter because they've left us with so many memorable films to see and enjoy. You know, we can always go back to those earlier great films which had in its credit title one very important title written by Salim Javed, because that ensured the film was going to be a great one. That's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And for those of you who haven't seen some of Salim Javed's work together as scriptwriters, most of their films are available on the OTTs or on YouTube. Do watch them and enjoy a glorious phase of Hindi cinema from the 1970s and 80s. That's all for this episode, and until the next time, bye for now.